What's going down, APUSH people? Today we're going to take a look at the South and the institution of slavery. If you're reading any of those APUSH books, American Pageant Chapter 16 or the other two you see, this lecture is going to help you out. So, a couple key things. Slavery in America has been going on. Unfortunately, the first slave ships come in 1619 to Jamestown. And of course, with Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, the colony of Virginia shifts from primarily indentured servants to black chattel slavery. Slavery was a major issue at the Constitutional Convention, but what happens is the framers of the Constitution postpone a solution to this problem, slavery, until later on. But we do have the Three-Fifths Compromise. The slave trade is agreed that it will end in 1808, but there will be a very important internal slave trade within the United States. And of course, in the Constitution, there is a fugitive slave law that said Southerners can go get their runaway slaves. We also saw that after and following the American Revolution, many states in both the North and the Middle areas, for example Pennsylvania and New York, are going to slowly abolish slavery. There is economic reasons for this. Slavery wasn't very important or profitable to those regions, but also ideological, right? You know, these inequalities in society are becoming more and more apparent when you're talking about natural rights and other things. So slavery is going to fade away from certain states. And of course, under the Articles of Confederation, we see slavery was banned by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So there was a banning of slavery north of the Ohio River in that territory, the Old Northwest. We also saw that during the Missouri Compromise, the issue of slavery caused a huge conflict, but ultimately both sides backed down. A truce was reached, which will postpone the issue of slavery to later decades. But of course, this compromise will gradually break down as confrontations over slavery became increasingly bitter. But the Missouri Compromise is important. So let's take a look at this kind of Southern society. And when you think about Southern society, you have to think about King Cotton. Cotton was key. The Southern economy was always reliant on cash crops, whether that be tobacco in Virginia during the colonial times or rice in South Carolina, but also cotton. And what really kind of sets this thing off like never before is Eli Whitney in the 1790s invents the cotton gin, which allows for this cash crop cotton to become very, very profitable because one individual can separate the seeds from the cotton with this machine. And as a result of this huge increase in cotton production, there's a demand for land for cotton production, which leads to a huge increase in the demand and the profitability of slave labor. And what you see is this is all being fueled by the market revolution. Northern industries are demanding this southern cotton, this raw materials, as well as England. And this is going to bring enormous prosperity in the textile mills, making really awesome shirts like the one you see right there. But prosperity not just for the South, but also the North and England. And it's being built on the backs of slave labor. And what you see is if you take a look at maps of this time period, in the 1820s, cotton production is largely, along the coast in South Carolina and Georgia. But as you see, as time goes on, by 1860, cotton production is moving west. And along with this increase in cotton production comes this demand for land, as well as this demand for slave labor. And you have this huge internal slave trade taking place where people are moving slaves between states, especially in these deep southern states. So here you have the slave concentration in 1820, and as you can see by 1860, there's this very, very huge percent of the population being more than 50% slave in states like South Carolina and Mississippi. Keep in mind, as the movement west takes place, this brings up issues, as we saw with the Missouri Compromise, over whether or not this new territory will be slave or free. Missouri Compromise is just one of these examples. You also have the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854. All of these will postpone and not end the crisis that will occur between the North and South. So we're going to take a look at the antebellum South, the pre-Civil War South. What did it look like? And a couple things. One is, obviously, it was a primarily agrarian society. Cotton is king. There's a lack of industrialization. There's really no need, if you're a Southerner, to industrialize because your money, your capital, was invested in slave labor. So you don't have the funds to industrialize, nor do you have a real desire to do so. 25% of the population of the South owned slaves. Important point, meaning the overwhelming majority, 3/4 of Southern whites, owned no slaves at all. The average number of slaves that were owned was less than 10, and yet the majority of Southerners are not slave owners, yet they support and defend the institution of slavery. And if you're asking why, well, one is there's a hope that they will one day own slaves, but also there's this racism. And there's this whole social hierarchy, and at the bottom of that social hierarchy in Southern society was, in fact, African American slaves. And so if you were at least above some group in society, that created a sense of comfort. In terms of Southern politics, it was in many ways an oligarchy, meaning a government by the wealthy few. And the people who really controlled Southern politics were the plantation owners, those people who owned, typically more than 100 slaves. The South was very undemocratic. There was a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and it was large slaveholders controlling Southern politics. They are the ones dominating the legislators of the different states. In fact, if you look at Southern society, it could be broken down into these four groups among Southern whites. You have the plantation owners. They are the very wealthy, the elite, the 1%. You have number two, the small slaveholders. These are people that typically own around 10 or fewer slaves. Then you have the majority of the population, which are the yeoman farmers. They own no slaves at all. And at the bottom of Southern white society are the people of the Pine Barrens. They own no slaves, and they also own no land. And then, of course, this is very different than the North. The North is industrializing. There's a lack of immigration to the South. If you're an Irish or a German or any immigrant, you're not going to go to the South because land is very expensive and the competition is free labor. There is no real reason to immigrate to the South. And as a result, those public school reforms like Horace Mann, you're not going to see that take place in the South either. And if you take a look at the Southern population between the whites, the slaves, and you have a free black population in some states, especially the upper South. You could see in Delaware, 17%, free African American, Virginia, 5%. But of course, like we saw, over half the population of states like South Carolina and Mississippi are in fact slaves. The Deep South is going to be very reliant on slave labor on these plantations. Now, what do the African American communities look like at this time? And you see a variety of experiences. One, the North, there was about 250,000 free African Americans in the North by the time of the Civil War in 1860. And life was not good for them either, even though there is no slavery in the North by this point in time. There was a lot of tension with Irish immigrants, with competition over low-skilled jobs. Who's going to be getting the low-skilled jobs? Well, African Americans and Irish immigrants are going to compete for those. And as a result, you're going to see a lot of racial tension in the North as well. A lot of people are surprised that there is a free black population in the South by 1860. It's also around 250,000 people. Many of these are African Americans who gained their freedom. Many are mulatto. They're of mixed race. Perhaps they had a white father who freed them. Many were freed after the American Revolution in the South. And some, they paid for their freedom. They were able to raise money by working extra hours, and they were paid a little bit of money, and over time they were able to buy their freedom. Of course, there were many restrictions on daily life for these free African American communities, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Slavery itself, important to keep in mind, it varied from region to region, from owner to owner. There was no one experience, but in all circumstances, slavery was based upon chattel slavery. Slaves were treated as property, and very often you would see families being separated. They were sold just as you would sell any piece of equipment on the farm. And this really was brought to to Northerners' attention with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, this idea of families being broken up in this institution of slavery. By the eve of the Civil War, like I said, most slaves were in the Deep South, so states like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and so on. And slaves, no matter where you were, no matter how nice or brutal your master was, they were not afforded any social, political, or civil rights. It was illegal to learn to read or write if you were a slave throughout the South. But in spite of all this, African American culture emerged as a blending of African and American cultural influences. Slaves developed their own culture and their own system. One of the key components of this is the African American religion, especially after the Second Great Awakening. Many slaves had been converted to Christianity, but what happens here is very unique. Black Christianity, especially amongst Methodists and Baptists, is going to adopt African practices, like the responsorial style of preaching, drawing on West African traditions, where you have this kind of, back and forth between the church leaders and the members of the church. And another important component of this is the importance of the black slave songs, the spirituals, and drawing on West African traditions in this culture. So this is key part of this experience. There is going to be enormous resistance to slavery, and forms of resistance take different types. For instance, slowly working, work slowdowns, negligence, breaking equipment was a way to rebel in a kind of covert way. There were more overt ways of resistance, such as running away. Harriet Tubman and her role with the Underground Railroad. Very difficult, though, to get away because of the large distances. And slave revolts, actually rebelling. Slave revolts were not uncommon for a number of reasons. Whites had the weapons. African Americans lacked allies in the South. But there were some. During colonial times, the biggest rebellion took place in 1739 in South Carolina as slaves tried to run away to Florida, and you have a number of white and slaves killed during the Stono Rebellion, eventually put down, and further restrictions being put upon slaves in South Carolina and other colonies. Denmark Vesey is another slave revolt. He planned it, Mr. Denmark Vesey, in South Carolina again. A massive revolt was planned. Vesey was a free African American, but unfortunately for Vesey, he is betrayed by informers, and he and some of his followers are killed. The one rebellion that actually led to the death of Americans during the post-American Revolution period happens in 1831, and that, of course, is Nat Turner's Rebellion. Make sure you know about that. It is the only revolt in which Southern whites are killed. About 60 Virginians, many of them women or children. Eventually, Nat Turner himself and his followers are killed. As a result of these revolts, Southerners are going to react. They're going to create harsher laws. There were already many harsh laws, but the Black Codes, which restricted the movement of free African Americans in the South, and also slave patrols are going to increase, hunting those individuals who have run away. You're also going to see the growth of an abolitionist movement as time goes on. One of the earliest opponents of slavery were Quakers. They were opposed to not only war, but also the institution of slavery during the colonial period. You also get other movements like the American Colonization Society. Their whole thing was to free slaves and then send them back to Africa. And in 1822, Liberia was formed. They name it Monrovia after the president. But that was never a very big movement because it wasn't very practical. And only about 12,000 slaves are sent to Africa. And the reason it wasn't very practical is many of these individuals had no connection to the continent any longer. They were born in America, they were American, and the American Colonization Society ultimately was a failed plan. You also have many African Americans taking the lead role in the abolitionist movement. One of the most famous ones is David Walker, a free African American who writes a very powerful piece of protest literature in 1829 called The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, in which he called on African people, African American people, to rebel in a violent uprising, and his pamphlet is banned throughout the South. William Lloyd Garrison is another abolitionist. In 1833, he creates the American Anti-Slavery Society, which calls for the immediate uncompensated emancipation of slaves. He publishes The Liberator, which is the anti-slavery newspaper, and him and his followers were very unpopular in the North and the South. And of course, some of the more famous former slaves who advocate for abolitionism after they get their freedom are people like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. And you also see slavery kind of infecting politics. In 1840, you have the Liberty Party forming, which starts to say the best way to deal with the issue of slavery is through the political process. So you have a lot of different abolitionist movements know their different strategies and philosophies. And then finally, as you have this reaction and this kind of criticism of slavery from the North, you see Southerners react with the whole defense of slavery. In fact, in Congress, you have the famous gag resolution being imposed, which from 1836 to 1844, it was illegal. It was actually banned to talk about slavery within Congress. There was a ban on any anti-slavery petitions being discussed or debated within Congress. This famously was overturned by John Quincy Adams in 1844, and so the issue of slavery is once again discussed in the halls of Congress. There are going to be bans on teaching slaves to read or write. This was seen as a path to resistance, so this was something that was very much enforced throughout the South. And of course, Southern states are going to have strict slave codes, especially after events like Nat Turner's revolt, because of this fear and wanting to ensure that future revolts do not materialize. Anti-slavery messages, anti-slavery literature such as David Walker's Appeal or the Liberator newspaper were banned from the South. They would not deliver it. And finally, you actually get the development of a pro-slavery argument among Southerners such as George Fitzhugh, John C. Calhoun, and others. And the argument comes down to this: slavery is a good thing. And this criticism of slavery is unjustified because there's this idea that slaves are being treated as family, this very paternalistic view of slavery, that we're taking care of these individuals. And this is better than what is happening in the North in factories with the wage slavery that takes place up there. The Southerners take care of their property, their slaves. And then finally, there's also this kind of civilization argument that these are inferior people and that by bringing them to America, forcibly bringing them to America, that we are uplifting and civilizing an inferior group. And obviously, you can see the BS in this. That's going to do it for today. Hopefully you learned some stuff. Subscribe to the channel. Click like if it helped you at all. Tell your friends, and happy studying. Peace.